With something like defence, there's a very easy out for him on that right now, which is Parliament isn't sitting. And you can argue that if you were to suddenly say something very significant outside of a budget and outside of Parliament sitting, then you would have the Speaker of the House of Commons being very angry and his MPs very angry. And while outside Westminster these things might look strange to people, it does really matter, particularly considering the focus that Andy Burnham himself has placed on doing things differently and keeping Parliament on side.
I wanted to talk, though, a bit more about the defence speech that we've got coming up later this week. We've heard Andy Burnham talking about how defence is a crucial part of his reindustrialisation. Wes Streeting was out and about yesterday. But the big unanswered questions, Anna, are still about funding, aren't they? Because both Wes Streeting and Andy Burnham have not so far made any specific pledges on spending, when we're going to be spending even 3% of our GDP on defence, nor indeed when or whether money's going to be found to properly fund the defence investment plan.
Yeah, exactly. There are two huge questions that have not been answered at all, really. One is the over £4 billion funding gap for the defence investment plan, which itself falls short of what John Healey himself wanted and a lot of people within the military want. And then separate from that is how to reach the NATO target, 3%, let alone the actual target of 3.5%, and the timeline of that. And I think what we'll have is we will have something on defence from Andy Burnham this week, later this week, but I suspect those funding questions will remain unresolved because so far every impression we're getting from the new Prime Minister is he is very good at making a very big, bold statement, showing direction of travel. I think the real difference he's trying to show is that he is taking personal ownership of decisions. He is driving government as opposed to letting it drive him or being driven by powerful advisors like Morgan McSweeney in Keir Starmer's case. But he isn't saying how he's going to achieve things yet. He's not giving detail. And with something like defence, there's a very easy out for him on that right now, which is Parliament isn't sitting. And you can argue that if you were to suddenly say something very significant outside of a budget and outside of Parliament sitting, then you would have the Speaker of the House of Commons being very angry and his MPs very angry. And while outside Westminster these things might look strange to people, it does really matter, particularly considering the focus that Andy Burnham himself has placed on doing things differently and keeping Parliament on side. So I suspect we won't see much clarity. The appointment of John Healey is, of course, a statement of intent and a signal, because Johnny Healey himself resigned over the inability to fund the plan properly. But time will tell whether John Healey will maintain those same principles. You know, he has a lot of respect across the board and also within Europe. His previous defence partnerships counterparts, he developed very good relations with them. But he also now is in the Treasury, which is, you could argue, sometimes the most powerful job, even more so than Prime Minister. So has he traded off some of those principles for that? We shall see.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's pointing, aren't they, to his budget in the autumn. And as Anna says, John Healey said that he was resigning from Keir Starmer's government because he felt that they weren't providing enough funds to keep the country safe. And I mean, we referred to various targets. The overall target, and Wes Streeting said, we're going to hit that, is 3.5% of our GDP by 2035. That's a NATO target. But of course, what governments have done up until now is just say, we'll reach that, but we'll sort of push all the funding, all the big increases in funding off till, at least well after the next election.
Yeah, you're right there. I mean, we had Wes Streeting on Times Radio yesterday, and as you say, he committed again to the 3.5% by 2035, which incidentally, many people think, now we are in a according to the experts, a pre-war situation is nowhere near enough, but it's easy to commit to something 9 years ahead, much harder, and he was more evasive on the 3% by 2030, which would effectively have to be set up and start being paid for in this Parliament, although he did say that the commitment to defence was a resignation matter for him, as it had been for John Healey. So I think that shows how they're thinking. I mean, I agree entirely with Anna, and she's right that there's lots of reasons for not announcing you're suddenly going to spend the money this week or in the middle of August. And I do think, from Burnham's point of view, there is a kind of softening up exercise, not softening up the country, softening up Labour support, and it does remind me a bit of Neil Kinnock dropping the commitment to unilateralism, that he needs to make these arguments, and he's going to make parallel arguments about saying he's not squeamish about wasting money on welfare and all that, and one can see a beginning of maybe piecing the bits together so that he, probably by the time of the Labour conference and Parliament returning, they will be able to make a much firmer defence commitment, but it will have to come from savings elsewhere. It's pretty clear that the idea of defence bonds floated by the Liberal Democrats is not really credible, because it just looks like borrowing. And then we had this interesting intervention today from Kemi Badenoch, reported in the Times, saying, well, look, I'll work with Andy Burnham, but my bottom line is no tax rises. Now, it makes absolute sense for the Tories to say that, but I think the fact that they're saying I'll work with Andy Burnham does give him a little bit to play with before almost certainly an inevitable confrontation with the Tories claiming that taxes under them would be lower.
I mean, two things. Firstly, I just wanted to touch on, I do find it interesting how Wes Streeting, the new Defence Secretary, has come out and said that, well, I was Health Secretary, and one of the reasons, one of the things I did in that brief was to modernise and to find savings, and that there are lots of places to find savings in the Ministry of Defence. And a lot of people who know the MOD will say that is absolutely true. But is Wes Streeting, with absolutely no disrespect to him as a politician, but it's going to be pretty hard for him, with no knowledge really in detail of defence, to come in and be able to. He's going to be quite dependent on the advisors in his department who are experts, because it is such an expert. If you don't know the detail, it's hard to know what is actually something you can trim and make savings in, and what is absolutely crucial. So there's that, and then. I did. I mean, what was Adam's excellent point just now?
well, just to pick up on what you were just saying there, Anna. I mean, it is interesting because a lot of people pointed to the fact that Wes Streeting doesn't have any military background, but it does seem as though the thinking is, well, look, you need a fresh pair of eyes. You can't have somebody who's just there aligned with the current setup in the MOD, because you need someone to tackle the fact that every single defence project overruns and
so
goes over
jargon
budget.
Heavy. How can you tell which ballistic missile?
Well, there is expertise out there, and we shouldn't forget there is the Strategic Defence Review, yes. Which was done by the experts. I mean, I have to say my overall view about should you have a teacher in the education department and a doctor in the health department? I don't think it works like that. I mean, I think the point is they are professional politicians, and their job is to manage and assimilate, a bit like, dare I say it, some specialist journalists or whatever, and to be able. And my assumption with Wes Streeting, who, let's face it, is one of the people who's brought about the Burman Premiership, is that he knows all of this. He knows people will say, what does he know? He knows what the argument is about defence, and presumably he wouldn't have given himself a hospital pass if he felt it was all there wasn't going to be the money there. And of course, although politicians, when they move department, can change their positions, it would be very difficult, I think, for a Treasury run by John Healey to be as negative towards defence spending as the Treasury run by Rex.
I just think it's on the finding savings. I think it's that so many people have promised this over and over again, and it's just one of those things that is very easy to say but is much, much harder in practice.
Just briefly before we go to the news, though, fascinating, isn't it? Andy Burnham said from the outset, or set out, he was clearly going to be focused on the domestic agenda, and we did see that last week with all those announcements on energy prices and bus prices and so on. But we're 1 week in, and he's meeting President Zelensky tonight. We've got the threat from Russia.
Yeah.
We've got the talk of a potential deployment in the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, he's not going to be able to escape.
But how were they presenting it down there in Portsmouth with Zelensky? Zelensky specifically talking about Portsmouth, saying, defence of the realm, military strength is domestic policy, and of course it does tie into so-called reindustrialization, another policy if you do it right.
And genuinely, when people look at how to this Andy Burnham argument that all the industries were closed and everything in the last 40 years was terrible. The one way of then kind of proposing a way forward from that is usually to talk about defence as an actual genuine new kind of industry, lots of new technology you could harness, bring back some of that capability when so much other industry has just been lost to globalization in China, etc., and is not going to come back realistically. But Boris Johnson's number 10 told me the exact same thing. They have tried it before, and I think hopefully things are different now, and if there's a bit more political will, perhaps, and the circumstances are different, perhaps they can manage it.
But it's also taking the public with you. I mean, that's the key point, that people say they're more interested in spending on defence than having welfare go up.